Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Derek Joel Fiedler. Today, we have a very special guest, ethnomusicologist Drew, who's studying music and culture in Northern Africa. And he's been very faithful in the comment section as a contributor to the music symbolism segment that we've had with guests Neil deGray, Jonathan Bajot, Alistair Roberts, Josh Martin. And today we're going to be joining in a conversation primarily to ask some important questions along this topic. What is music? What are linkages of music and culture? Why are we creatures that sing? And can we have a culture without music? So Drew, glad you joined me today. How are you doing?
Derek, thanks for having me. This is great. I'm doing great. It's morning where you are. It's evening where I am. Here in North Africa. And the one qualifier I would add is that I would say I'm an amateur ethnomusicologist. I do have a master's in ethnomusicology. My trade primarily is I'm a music teacher. I teach band, choir, and guitar at an international school here in Tunis.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so I'm a music teacher, good into audio production, but primarily a piano teacher myself.
Cool.
Yeah, that's like, so I have a day job where I work in the community with housing. And then I have I guess this would be my hobby, is having conversations and writing articles and posting video essays like this. But then I guess my side thing would be that I teach music lessons. It's right now it's for charity work. I do make some money, but it's at a very affordable rate, primarily for my friends' kids.
Yeah, when I teach music, it's within the context of a school system. So my approach to teaching music is at the mercy of the structures that be in formal education. So that's
right. Yeah,
another way of teaching and learning music.
Yeah, I've been there too. So I was actually teaching piano, and recording was my day job when I lived in Portland, Oregon, many seasons ago.
Private lessons are great. I taught private saxophone early on. Saxophone's my primary instrument, and it's just a really great way to, especially from the beginning stages, get to know a learner and then just like help them grow, and you get to see such monumental improvement over the course of time. It's that one-to-one relationship in private teaching is a really cool thing to be able to experience, and then once you get bigger, when you're teaching bands and you have 80 kids to keep a track of, it can be a little bit more challenging maintaining that personal connection with students. And so I love teaching privately though, when I have time for it.
Right. And so here you are, you're a music teacher, but then you had enough time to get a master's in ethnomusicology and write a almost 250-page thesis.
Yeah. So when I started here in Tunis in 2017, I also began my online master's program. It was through Liberty University, and that took the program was flexible enough that you could just do it part-time until you finished. And the requirement was that you had to finish it in under 5 years, and so I did it in 4. It's one of those things where it's like you take 1 or 2 classes at a time, and it was 42 credits plus the thesis defense, and so it was already beefy as it was, and it just, in order to maintain my sanity, I just couldn't do more than one course or 2 at the time. And those final papers at the end of each semester, especially if you had 2 at the end of the semester with and then I'm leading a concert with my students, and then report cards are in, and then I'm married, and then there's that whole dynamic at home of balancing work with family and school, and also trying to learn Arabic as I go along. And so the last 4 years, the rhythm in my life was really shall we say presto. It's just a lot. It's just a lot.
Yes.
In my life. So, but now things are starting to, that's not there anymore. And it's given me some time to be able to do conversations like this, have a little bit more time to pursue some of my own interests that I'm more interested in. I just started learning the banjo. I'm also learning the oud, which is an Arab lute. And so I'm really grateful that the master's is done and I can be able to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I totally feel you with the balancing, getting to that shaving point of okay, I only have 2 hours left in this day 4.
Yeah.
studies and for hobbies and for learning and for, gosh, like catching up with all the podcasts these days. So
Yeah, there's
uh
too much. There's too much out there.
yeah, so I've come to this point where actually the day job has really helped, where I'm like, now I can slot things. I know I have, 6 hours a week to dedicate towards, conversations like these. And I have so many hours for, I also play the banjo actually.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so I was trained since I can remember in the piano. My mom, let's see, on my dad's side, both his mom and his dad were professional organists in the Lutheran church. And
Wow.
so I have that background. I have some other music. I also, my grandpa, he was on the radio, and I have a whole side of my family that's like, they have a radio network in the Bible Belt that's like millions and billions of dollars. He has a private jet. So like
What?
yeah, it's just interesting, kind of like tracing the family tree into oh, that kind of explains why I'm into what I'm into.
Wait, so you
So
said it was on your mom's side? Your grandpa was an organist?
mom's side is the radio
The radio.
and ministry. And then on my dad's side, my grandpa was a music teacher and professional organist and music
Okay.
director. But my dad tells me that his mom was actually the better of the two when it came to the organ and piano.
Hmm.
But she was,
Okay.
yeah, she wasn't on the stage, so she didn't get quite the attention as grandpa.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so piano, but so I was trained in piano, maybe like in that, private lesson, academic setting, did jazz band in the JC level, junior college. So I have that formal side, but then um, I have this banjo thing where it's just like, I want to learn this thing from a totally different avenue. And so no books, no anything, just picking around. And the banjo is a really great instrument to lend itself for that type of
Oh, it's
approach.
so fun. It is so fun to just sit and figure it out. I'm doing the three finger style. Is that what you did, or were you claw
Oh,
hammer?
okay. So yeah, so there's two main styles. I started with claw hammer, which I think
Okay.
has the better name.
Scrug style. Scrug style is cool.
Scrug is cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
banjo just is cool all the way
It's
around.
just a cool instrument.
So yeah, the claw hammer, which is fun because you kind of like get this posture right in the right hand. You just punch it right with like a little
Yeah.
pluck at the when you're bringing it back up. So it kind of feels like slapping the bass. But then what's neat about that is that it's very friendly to the beginner. So I was
Yeah.
introduced to Scruggs style when I was visiting. Like they have a huge bluegrass folks music scene over in Colorado. So I was up
Yes.
in
That's where I
the
got my banjo actually.
oh really?
So
Yeah.
so yeah, so I'm from Washington State originally, but over the summer, my wife and I did a road trip. Actually, I had wanted a banjo for years, and this was the year that we decided to pull the trigger. And so, researched all the models, what's good for a beginner, settled on a Deering. I forgot what their beginning. I can't remember what it's called.
Is
Not
it a
Magic Sound. I can't remember. One of the Deering models was the beginning, and then the other one was the gold tone, and so I knew I wanted one of those too, and so I went on a Craigslist who was selling one of those models, and then we went to different antique stores, pawn shops, music stores, and then at the last part of our road trip, we were in Denver, and that's when I found the Denver Folk Life Center, I think is what it's called, and they sell just hundreds of banjos and mandolins and all sorts of folk instruments, part of that old country folk tradition. So they had the banjo I was looking for, and so got it,
perfect?
brought it over to Tunis, and been having just a heck of a time playing it.
Awesome. Yeah, I have a good time made
Yeah,
out of maple
that's what
banjo.
it is. That's what it is. The
Oh,
good time.
awesome.
That's
Yeah, it's
right.
like it weighs 4 pounds. It's like I took it when I traveled in Costa Rica. I brought it with me and found like maybe the only other person that had a banjo in Costa Rica that I knew of.
I saw one guy, one Tunisian guy here downtown playing a banjo on the street, and it was not anything. It was not American style banjo. Let me just put it that way. They adapt instruments to their music, and so they're playing it a lot. There's another instrument called the dutar, which is like one string is a drone string, and then the other string you use as melody, and so you're sort of using it sort of like that. With one string was just kind of droning, and then the other one was doing melody. So it's just yeah. And then Bela Fleck did his documentary tracing the roots of the banjo to Africa, and he goes on this tour in Africa, visiting all of the regions, and making music with local musicians, and then on this sort of pilgrimage, finding the origin of the banjo in Africa, and then meet some musicians who play that, and they record this whole album, and that was a really cool documentary.
Oh my goodness, I have not watched that.
It's called Throw Down Your Heart.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Because like if you look at the banjo, it's definitely like the platypus of the stringed instrument family, because it's like stretched over like a snare guitar or drum or something.
Strings over a head. Yeah, it's like strings on an actual head, which is not, there's no other instrument that does that. So
super cool. Yeah, so I picked up a lot of techniques with the Scruggs style, which is more of like arpeggios, like notes, different arrangements of, instead of playing like chord, like strumming it with a pick, you're actually like playing each note individually, sometimes really fast. That was a larger learning curve for me. So I didn't really get into it right away with the banjo, but I did on the piano. Like I ended up, because, like that's more of a fluent language, so to speak, for me. And so that's one of my unique styles is, I guess the secret behind it is that I learned it from struggling to not really learn it on the banjo, but then play it on the piano.
Yes.
So it's like this really fast, like arpeggiated, like, 3 to 4 notes.
Right.
And it's totally a banjo thing if anybody hears it.
Yes.
So, all right, man. So how did you, and maybe just a little bit about your background. I'm really curious how you ended up in Africa and how you ended up studying ethnomusicology.
So did my bachelor's in music education 2013. I knew I wanted to teach music. I had a really great band director when I was in high school. Very inspired to pass on this gift of music to other students that, hopefully they would then pass on music. And so I went to a university where they were the largest music education program in Washington State. I believe they still are. And so that got me on the path career-wise, teaching music. I've always been a band guy. Saxophone was my primary instrument. And then it wasn't until after I got to college that I started learning doubles, flute, clarinet. I still suck at flute. My clarinet's not too bad. But I teach beginners every year. And so I always pick up a new instrument with the beginners, which is a great way to learn. So by now I can actually play some things on all of the band instruments. Well, during our time in college, my wife and I, we were not yet married. We went with our campus ministry to a conference where in another part of the country, in Texas, where they arranged for, it was a large gathering of Chi Alpha was the campus ministry that we were part of. There was a
Chi Alpha, of course.
Yeah. So it was a large gathering of Chi Alpha.
Yeah. So
the greater Chi Alpha networks here in Fort Worth, Texas. So
okay, so it's like okay, so I was a part of a Chi Alpha ministry called it was at the University of Davis in California, and it was Davis Christian Fellowship, and they were rooted in Chi Alpha. Will Clear's the pastor. Awesome. It was like a family away from home. So you went to a gathering. So like there's Chi Alphas or these like clubs or groups, campus ministries all throughout the country, throughout the world. And so you went to a convention where a lot of those all gathered into one place.
Yeah, and that convention was called the World Mission Summit, where they also brought in hundreds of missionaries and people who worked overseas there to show prospective Chi Alpha students, what are some overseas opportunities for service. And around that time, just taking classes at my college, I took an East Asian Studies class, and part of that class was dedicated to Southeast Asia, and I learned about Indonesia, and I remember just being really just fascinated by that country. Learning that it was the world's largest Muslim country, but it was in this like Asian context, and I didn't know anything about it, and I also learned about Indonesian music in a music class that I took. So there's a part of my bachelor's, there's a class called Music and Cross-Cultural Perspectives. In other universities, it might just be called World Music. And so in this class, we spent a week just talking about Indonesian music, gamelan, other kinds of pop music and folk music, and also just being really fascinated there. And so going to this convention, I was really interested in meeting people who were working in Indonesia. And so we met some people who were doing Chi Alpha in Indonesia, and that provided a contact. By the end of that conference, both my wife and I felt really called to go overseas for at least a short period of time, and we felt resolved that Indonesia would be the place that we'd want to go. And so after we graduated, we got teaching jobs and worked, paid off our student loans, and then felt that the time was right to then move overseas for a year. And so we teamed up with that Chi Alpha in Central Java in a town called Jogja. And so that was our first overseas experience. We were there for a year. And over the course of that time, I would say that music and the saxophone and jazz was my biggest inroads, meeting with Indonesians, locals, and developing quick relationships. In a lot of international postings, depending on the type of job you're in, it takes a long time to learn a local language, and that can be a barrier to developing deep relationships with people. And so I was really thankful that I had this way of being able to have a shared experience that was meaningful with people who did not speak my language most of the time, but we could still communicate with one another just fine through the idiom of jazz and through me learning about their music and trying to, and playing in events together. And so like that, and Indonesian people are just so kind and deferential, and they're, in my opinion, the nicest people on the planet. Like, they're just so humble and warm and inviting and hospitable. And all it took was for me to show up to one jazz jam session, and where it's located downtown, it's in this outdoor venue. And they pack in 150 seats, and there's people serving coffee at like 8 p.m. Because why not? And
Yeah.
it's humid, and and there's the traffic going on there, and they're just playing all sorts of jazz standards or funk, or just whatever music offering that musicians wanted to. It was like a big gathering of people from the Jogja community to just have a jam session together, and you could call out whatever tune you wanted to play, and the rhythm section players, the bass, piano, guitar, drums, they were so versatile. They could play just about anything in just about any key. And so it only took me to just show up one time, and I called out a tune, and we played it, and afterwards everyone's getting my phone number, and I'm getting phone numbers, and then they're calling me to their gigs, and saying, hey, there's a festival in a village, outside, why don't we, would you like to join us? And it's this village out in the mountains. And then so like these opportunities kept escalating in such a short amount of time that, by the time I finished my, my 9 months there in Jogja, I'd already played on an international gamelan, jazz festival stage. And I'd already, I played in a TV broadcast program, which is on YouTube. And so it was just crazy how much opportunity there was musically in this country. Meanwhile, learning about the history of this really fascinating country with a tantric Buddhist, Hindu, Javanese ethnic religion substrate, but then it's also the world's largest Muslim country. And so Islam is on top of that, with European colonialism on top of that. And so you have this cross section of so much historical identity going back over the centuries, and then just having these conversations with Indonesians about meaning and faith, and just noticing patterns in their society that for me were it was really hard for me to grasp, because sometimes it just felt a little bit incoherent, where it's okay, everybody's a Muslim, and yet the logo for the National Art Institute is I forget her name, the Hindu goddess of music. I'm trying to, her name's escaping me off the top of my head, but like with the forearms and anyways, it's just, this was weird. Like, is this syncretism? What's going on here? How are they navigating their identity here as a people? And so that got me really interested in thinking about culture and society and meaning, on a serious level, and how music can be an interface to have those kinds of conversations, how music can be a
Mm.
way to express that. And I did get to,
Drew,
yeah, go ahead.
let me just insert this. So it reminds me of, narratively, I'm really into sci-fi. People haven't noticed, and it reminds me of, what was it, First Encounters of the Third Kind, the
Yep.
Spielberg story, and where like the climax of the movie, like the aliens and the humanity, and this like the ultimate foreigner, you could call it, are trying to communicate, and it's not math, it's not language, it's actually music, right? And they have like the synthesizer, bing, boom, boom,
Yeah, they tried to
boom.
modernize that with that movie Arrival. Did you ever see Arrival?
Oh my gosh, don't even get me started on Arrival. Dude, I'm like working on 6 thesis right now, um, for the Symbolic World blog. I might write a book on it. It's I would consider it the most profound story made in my lifetime.
Wow.
Anyway,
Okay.
what are your thoughts on it?
I'm excited about that. I mean, I don't have any deeper thoughts on that. I mean, eventually we'll be talking about music as a language. What does I like? I think of it as like bird song. We like to think of bird song as birds communicating to one another through song. And I think that's an anthropocentric. We're putting that on top of what birds are actually doing. Do we know that what birds are perceiving song as song, or is bird song when they're communicating with one another, is that just for them mundane communication, sending signals, right? In the sense of, and to us it sounds pleasant. Oh, it's so melodic, how these birds are communicating, to one another. It must be song. But in the human world, a song means something very different than signaling and making communications. You have your doorbell is 2 musical tones. Usually it's a minor third or a major third, um, but it's not used as music. It's a signal. And so there you get into different kinds of ways of using musical sounds to communicate things. And music as such, I think, can't remember if it was on your podcast or someone else was defining music as heightened communication. It is communication, but then it's not just communication. It's doing things that mere communication doesn't do. By the way, that Hindu goddess was Saraswati. I just remembered.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so yeah, very interesting. Heightened communication. So to your story, it just reminded me of, like, you go into a foreign land, right? And the way that you, in a foreign land, in a place where people are speaking and doing things in a totally, well, mostly foreign way, that connecting point, that referential point that you're able to then establish relationship, was jazz music.
Yeah, and it's really important to qualify. Okay, we could start talking about this now. Is music a universal language? Um, it's really important to qualify that we are communicating through a shared idiom, and that idiom is a Western idiom that is jazz. And this is an idiom that uses tonal harmony. It comes from the States and is exported globally through a variety of means, such as audio recording technology, colonialism. Why is it that in the middle of Java, these Indonesians are playing African American music? What's the genealogy of that? And so that's an important question to ask. And why are they doing it? And why are they continuing to pass it on generation after generation? What about that music speaks to them in such a way that they love to do it? But they were fluent in the language of jazz, so much so that I, speaking not a word of Bahasa Indonesia, can just show up one night with my saxophone, bebop away through a tune, and immediately develop this connection with these musicians who then want to keep me around and want me to continue to play with them. it's different than, and I was about to talk about this, playing gamelan music. Gamelan music is not tuned to Western instruments. It's impossible, in fact, to merge the two tuning systems. They're just not in tune with one another. Now, the gamelan instruments have a tuning protocol. Gamelan, if you don't know what gamelan is a percussion style of music that is specific to Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia, and it's metallophones. Everything is metallic: pots, gongs, um, and made out of brass, and different. These are all metal percussion instruments, and gamelan orchestras are large ensemble, large meaning perhaps 20 musicians all playing on these different metallic metallophones. You also have a spike fiddle player, and then there's also a flute player involved, and then there's a singer involved too. It is an acoustic journey for someone who is not used to those kinds of sounds the first time you hear them. For me, if I could think of a polar opposite to Western music, it would be the classical music of Southeast Asia. Thai classical music. Gamelan's up there for sure. Korean classical music, pretty much any of the court musics deriving from Asia, specifically Southeast Asia. When I say polar opposite, I mean the likelihood that you're going to enjoy listening to it is very, very low the first time you hear it. And the likelihood that you're going to go back for repeat listenings is also very low.
Not something that you just listen while you're strolling through the woods or anything.
No.
Yeah. So it reminds me of Arrival, because in Arrival, it's funny you bring this up, because I think I'm going to be having a talk with JP Marceau, who's really interested in aliens all of a sudden. And so I'm like, okay, man, then let's come on and let's make it happen. And something that we were leading to is this difference between, okay, if aliens arrive, if they descend to the earthly realm, are they going to be benevolent? Are they going to be malevolent? Is this Arrival or is this Independence Day?
Yeah.
So with Spielberg's, say let's just choose the benevolent, right? It's a good experience. They've come here to share and to learn. But if you compare and contrast Spielberg's movie or story, where like music is a universal referential point, the first point of reference, then we can begin this relationship. Or is it Arrival, where it's verbal and written language? And is it actually like a spoken written thing? So is it music or is it spoken written? And with Arrival, it's interesting though, because it is auditory, kind of like the birds. It's funny because they have a canary and a coal mine bird in the chamber, the inner chambers of the space vessel. And it's chirping away. But it's kind of like we don't understand what the bird is saying, but we can tell that there's music and sound happening. Same thing with the alien species, the heptapods in Arrival, where they are making these like whale groaning, clucking sounds. And is it like that, what'd you say, anthropocentric thing? We're like, oh, is that language? We're not really sure. Are they just like gargling, or are they actually like saying something?
Yeah. Well, even the tune didn't John Williams do the music for Close Encounters?
Pretty sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, where do they get da, 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 right? Why is it even possible that this like alien species is producing equally tempered notes?
Yeah, on a pentatonic scale,
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Like, if an alien were to arrive, like, would it be like that experience? Like, what would you imagine it being like? I mean,
I don't even think,
as a person that's studied, foreign cultures, like, about as opposite of our Western framework as it can get, and then you're trying to like establish a grammar or a foundation, a frame of reference to even perceive what type of exchanges of meaning are taking place. Like, what would that be like?
In my opinion, this is where some people would disagree with me, but dogs don't experience human music the way humans experience human music. right? Think about and even just think about their ears. They can hear frequencies way higher than humans can. Their oral experience of the world is so different to how humans orally experience the world. If we all had dogs' ears, music would be a different experience. That would fundamentally change what kinds of sounds we like. Um, that would change the range of pitches that we like to hear, right? Lots of things change. So I would imagine that a species, let's say a silicone-based life form from a another planet, like the atmosphere would be so different. It's just like if music is, as Adam Neely calls it, wiggly air, then even the
Wiggly.
substance, then the substance of the air as such on another planet would be, there'd just be so many things that would be different. Where do we get our instruments from? Our instrumentarium traditionally would come from whatever your local resources were, right? The oldest known flute is a bone flute made out of a taken from the bone of a like an eagle's wing or something like that. The all frame drums from different parts of the world. So you have the darbuka in the Middle East, and in Arabic music, it's made out of clay. The djembe is made out of wood, right? These are local resources that produce local sounds that sound like local ethnicity, and so it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that, look, if human cultures don't even universally agree on a tonal center, on tonal harmony as such, right? If tonal harmony is not a universal, then imagine an alien species developing its own music with its own language, with its own anatomy, with its own environmental resources. There's just no way the elements will be remotely similar, or at least the application of the elements.
So the real question is, if aliens were to come down, the benevolent ones, they're generally, like, say they're ethnomusicologists, right? And they come to understand humans like we try to understand birds or something. Would they like our music?
I think well, I mean, it even just depends. Like they might even see us doing music and being like, are they doing something religious? Like, because they would
Mm.
see an event of like a rock concert, they would see 60,000 people cram into a stadium. They would see, maybe six people on a stage doing something that's causing mass reaction on the part of the whole. The first instinct would be to say, what kind of ritual is happening here? The first instinct would be to say, why are they doing that? The way we see ants when they, there's this incredible footage, I can't remember where in the world it is, of ants who created this insane city structure underneath the ground. And we marvel at that. And we wonder, like, wow, look at the organization of that. Well, I imagine an alien xenoethnomusicologist studying human behavior. It's so hard to like take the layers up. The reason I like to look at music as ritual fundamentally is because the word music is itself a social construct, in the sense of the word music's not an objective term. The word music comes from the Greek, which means art of the muses. Who were the muses? They were a divine being. And so we're already talking about something that has divine associations that's really hard for us to separate out from what we like. We have an immediate transcendent understanding of what music is. And so I don't know if an alien species would have arrived at our current secular definition of music, where they're going to actually look at a species and separate the music out of everything else that they're doing and just look at the sound structures. I think it would be more of along the lines of a ritual specialist would be looking at what humans are doing with music today. Because historically, music it's just always ritual. It's ritual all the way down. Ritualization of sound and human play, the context in which we use music, it's not separated from other pieces of reality. So
Yeah. So that kind of brings up the question of, can we have a culture without music? As we
right.
use that term.
Yeah. Um, I think that my answer to that question would be, we have not seen any culture that does not have music. There is no empirical evidence of any people group on Earth, past, present, that does not have singing. I'll say that. Singing is in every culture. Singing is a human universal. Not everybody sings, but every culture, including every subculture, if I might add, if we were to apply that to the Western society, has song has music, has a soundtrack. Every ethnic group, there's music that's important to that ethnic group. And then I would then apply it to every religion has music. And in fact, if music is not universally applied to every context, the context in which it is universally applied to is in religious contexts.
Right. So it's like you can't have one without the other. But that kind of gets into like the podcast that you shared with me, Sparking Creativity, the Ethno Arts, and just how they were introducing ethnomusicology and just sharing the story about how a people group in Brazil go about music, and they play a clip of it, and it's like most people's reaction is what? It's like, are they sad? Are they like struggling? Like it almost doesn't sound like music, but it kind of is. And it sounds kind of more of like that, like maybe the sounds from the heptapods and from Arrival. And then it does, like a song that we are familiar with and enjoy. So that's kind of the leading part of that question is a culture without music, can that even take place? It's like, well, first we have to kind of like do what Jordan Peterson does. What do we mean by culture? What do we mean by music? What do we mean? What do we mean by without? But so with music, it's like we have a presupposition about what that even means and what we're expecting when we think about music. But in that podcast, and what you've talked about before, is you go to other places in the world and there isn't a direct translation. They don't have a word for music like we have music. And what they would have is like, oh, you mean the thing we participate in? Oh, you mean the thing that we play out? Like, so I don't know what's happening there. Like, what's going on?
So that example that you were just talking about from the Ethno Arts podcast, if I were to describe the sound, it's sort of like they're almost chanting, and it sounds like it's a lot of people. It's almost like the whole village is in on it. It's a lot of voices happening at the same time. It's not polyphony. Polyphony is when you have multiple melodies intermingling. They're all chanting the same melody, but they're not on pitch with each other. They're like micro intervals away from one another, right? And then the actual, and so when they're chanting, they're not even in perfect rhythm with each other. They're just sort of, think of like almost like this wave effect of voices sort of trailing each other.
If it were an instrument, it would remind me of like a muffled tuba, a lazy muffled tuba, like 100 of them in a room, where it's like okay, some get onto the note right away, others are like 2 seconds behind, and they're not all
this is a
there.
Texture. Musicologists would call this texture heterophony. And so heterophony is the effect of multiple voices or parts performing the same melodic line, but each is stylizing it in its own way, or they're just sort of staggering rhythmically with one another. And so you have, I don't know how many voices are in that recording. I'm just gonna say 50 voices, and they're all just sort of following each other in this staggered way. And the range of the melody, it's not a big, they're not going up a scale or anything like that. They're maybe going up a couple of pitches, maybe within a third or something.
Yeah, it'd be like C, D, and E.
Yeah, it'd be and they're just sort of going up and down. They're just sort of droning on up and down. And so this effect, so okay, so why do we notice this? Why does this challenge our sensibilities about what is music? And well, there's no beat in the classic sense of a 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? There's no harmony in the sense of discrete intervals produced at the same time. And without tonal harmony and without a clear beat, you're already leagues away from what we're used to hearing on a daily basis in commercials and radio and pop music. But what's interesting is that like chant in the church, like Gregorian chant, Orthodox chant, Quranic chant, there's no beat there. It's one voice. unaccompanied. There's no chords. Um, well, there's something to say about that as well. But is that music? I would say, who's to say it's not music? I would say music is not a universal language, only because you don't know the rules of every style of music in the world. You know, like even within Western genres, like a rock musician can't step into a jazz club and participate in bebop. Vice versa. You know, like someone who's trained in bebop couldn't just walk into, you know, a rock and roll show, heavy metal show, doom metal show, right? And sit in on that style of music. They're just and they're musically different and distinct because the cultures around them are distinct and different, and the values which produce the sounds that are salient for that culture, for that subculture. Well, this is where we get into the surface structure, deep structure piece.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So there's an ethnomusicologist named John Blacking, and he's one of the founders of the modern field of ethnomusicology. Ethnomusicology has gone through lots of stages since it began at the end of the 19th century. So it begins at the end of the 19th century as a field called comparative musicology. And comparative musicology is concerned with, okay, so empires are forming at this time. And Western empires, the French, the English, they're encountering all of these musics in these places that they're colonizing that they're just not getting it right. They just don't sound like, you know, Beethoven, you know. And comparative musicologists were interested in figuring out these scale systems that exist in the Middle East and in India, these places with really complex classical systems. These are music traditions that go back centuries, even thousands of years in the case of India. They're very systematized, theorized, and so comparative musicologists, these guys from the end of the 19th century, someone like Alexander Ellis, Guido Adler, they were really interested in objectively measuring the tunings of scales. And so actually, if you're familiar with tuning instruments at all, if you ever tuned a guitar, you know that your tuner will give you a number. It'll say that you're 5 cents sharp or 30 cents flat. Well, that system of tuning by sense was invented by Alexander Ellis for the purpose of being able to measure these scales found in other parts of the world. And so that was the tool that was originally designed to measure that. And over the course of the subsequent decades, comparative musicology, they're like, well, why are we calling it comparative musicology? Isn't every field of study comparative inherently anyways? So why don't we just call it musicology? And then comes the concept in the 40s of ethnomusicology, which is coined by Jaap Kunst, who I believe is Dutch. And ethnomusicology specifically starts to pair this idea of music with ethnos, with people, with ethnic groups and ethnicity. Decades goes on. By the time you get to the 60s, you get these really seminal. So ethnomusicology as a field becomes a more established discipline in academia, and right alongside musicology, right? And so musicology is concerned with Western classical music, Western music theory, Western music history, specifically in its classical paradigm. Ethnomusicology is essentially, we're going to use these methods of musicology, but we're going to look at non-Western music. And so that was the priority of ethnomusicology at the beginning. In the 60s, you have these important musicologists. Alan Merriam is probably the most important name, but you also have John Blacking and Mantle Hood, Keith Mantle Hood. And John Blacking is sort of the first generation modern ethnomusicologist in his approach to studying music in culture, music as culture. And so he had, in his studies of Southern African children's music, he developed a concept called surface structures and deep structures. And his whole point, Blacking's point, was you can't know what music means with, you need to consider everything if you're going to understand music. If you're going to understand Mozart's music, you need to understand everything that was going on in Mozart's head. You need to understand Mozart's place in society, his era. You need to understand um, what other music genres were in existence in the time of when Mozart was composing. You need to consider social class. You need to consider gender. You need to consider his sociological status. All of these things have some sort of imprint or effect on his style of music. In the same way, you would apply that same level of analysis to Hindustani classical music, to Southern African, the music of the Venda, who he looked at. And so he had this concept of surface structures and deep structures, which I believe is also a linguistic concept. There's a lot of overlap between linguistics as a field and ethnomusicology as a field. Ethnomusicologists like to borrow from linguists and anthropologists a lot because they intersect a lot as a field. So surface structures, these are the things that we see, hear, experience through the senses on the surface. You can just imagine it's the surface, right? These are the actual sounds we hear. Deep structures, these are the things of culture. These are the things of values. These are the things of the society that are, let's say, intangible, but they're there, and they inform the things that you're experiencing on the surface. And so a linguist, in linguistics, you have the concept of the phonetic and the phonemic, right? And so the phonetic, things that are phonetic, those are the actual sounds coming out of my lips. Things that are phonemic, these are linguistic constructs that are specific to that language. So English has a bunch of phonemes that are unique to English that you don't have in French. But the phonetics, you can hear the sounds that are coming out of my voice. This is why when you go to YouTube, you can look up like fake accents of such and such language, and you have these YouTube videos of people who just make up what Russian sounds like, or they make up what French sounds like, and you can really understand it if you listen to a non-English speaker making up what they think English sounds like, and you're like, yeah, that's kind of interesting to hear what.
Yeah, it's like the classic like high school prankster who calls Walmart customer service with like an Australian or an Indian accent or something.
Yeah. And so in ethnomusicology, that concept of the surface and the deep, we hear these structures on the surface. There are deeper structures in culture, in the religion, in the way the society is arranged, that, well, those surface structures arise from those deeper structures. That's the concept in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's interesting because to bring it back to our sci-fi examples, encounters versus arrival, it makes sense that those two films would have a similar answer, but one has music and one has language. If ethnomusicologists and linguistic studies have, so much overlap and they share so much of their studies or framework for approaching their studies. What I also find interesting is to the point of arrival, they're like, this is going to take time. Because we have to figure out and establish the deep structures, if I'm understanding that correctly. And the general and the scientists and everybody are like, they're trying to rush the process. They're like stuck on the surface level of like, what do we have to do to make sure that they're not going to blow us up? And with encounters, in music, it was, they really rushed that part. That was like the climax. And so it was like flashy. It had lots of lights, which is also interesting. And it totally, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've seen it or read it, but they kind of like they overlook that explanation of like, no, this is going to take time to establish the deep structure of our culture and theirs in order for us to actually like have a meaningful exchange with music, to be able to jam together.
Right.
Because like, for example, another example is like with jazz, like there's so much referential riffs. So like jazz, like you could say, was built upon the musical films of the 20s and 30s or 40s, Broadway musicals, like how Gershwin informed Oscar Peterson and Thelonious Monk and everybody else. Like they would take what's there and they would like do like a little riff of that melody, and all of a sudden it's like, an Over the Rainbow reference here, then it's A Night in Tunisia over here. And then
That's a good point.
it's like, my favorite things. Like it's like you could have all of those within one sax solo in a jazz song.
Yes.
But if you
Yes.
don't have,
Yes.
but if you don't have all of, oh, that's from that song. Oh, that's from that artist. That's so cool how they like wove those together. Like what would jazz have been during that time?
Right. And even if you're just trying to analyze a Charlie Parker improvisation, or a John Coltrane improvisation, or a Dexter Gordon improvisation, or something like that, without consideration for the broader culture around jazz, without considering, historically what came before, without considering the fact that so much of improv is just stealing from other players, right? You could just
Mhm.
look at the one improv and just one snapshot and then try to draw your conclusions
Yeah, it's like agreeable
based on
stealing.
yeah, exactly. It is, yeah. Um, and that's just talking about the musical constructs. Bebop emerges from a specific time, right? And then Miles Davis does what he does at a specific time, and there's reasons that Miles Davis expands into the modal jazz and into the cool jazz movement, and then even further on as he goes on to innovate fusion, built on all these things. These things don't just come in some vacuum. There's
Mhm.
there's historical and cultural contingencies that need to be looked at to be
Yeah,
understood, to really understand what's happening in the music.
a couple references on that note. Elul in the Technological Society, he makes that claim where it's like new technology builds upon the platform and the advancements of previous technology. So like to study technology would be a study in history, because I mean, we see that, like, look at the computer, who knows what DOS is even more anymore, but like it's that deep structure of, I don't know, Apple App Store, so it's like we have these like total platform upon a platform until now we have like this interface of the web as we know it today.
Yeah.
But the other thing too is how we're we're coming to a point where I'm realizing that we're starting to use some musical terms, and I'd like to get soon to the point where you can describe the elements of music as you lay it out in your thesis. Um, but I also want to direct people towards how, well, I guess this leads Neil deGrasse in our first conversation. He talked about the element of music harmony as a way of establishing the environment or the context from which a melody emerges, or the identity of the song can be extended. And so I think that, yeah, now would be a good time. I'm really curious to know what are the primary elements of music, and how do they work together to where we can even understand and appreciate music as such.
So the first thing I want to say on the topic of musical elements in general, they're not they're not like real things in the sense of they don't obviously exist. They are analytical abstractions to be able to describe what's happening in music. We come up with these terms to best explain what we think is happening in music for certain purposes. And so I would argue that there is no universal list of elements of music that can and should be applied in all ways to every style of sonic performance, to every instantiation of sound in its ritualized form that we call music. Some of the elements are just irrelevant when it comes to studying certain kinds of music. Um, I teach 8 elements of music to my students, and these are elements that I think are the most relevant to the music that we study in school.
Now the
At
question
least,
is,
yeah.
why not 9? Why not 10 like Victor Wooten?
Right.
I don't know if
Yeah.
I wouldn't want
Well,
to.
I looked at Wooten's list, and we can talk about that.
It kind of reminds me of
What?
like the 6-minute ab guy from Something About Mary. If you ever watched that, it's like, well, what if someone comes out with 5 minutes? No, man, you can't even warm up in that time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well,
Anyway,
Brueggemann's list
okay.
is an example of this. Like his list, as I conceive it, is applicable to styles of music for which groove is a salient point, for which it's very much influenced by
Oh, and that's very
pop
interesting
music.
because he doesn't call it the elements of music, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly. He calls it the elements of groove.
yeah, yeah. And so
What's that about?
that list is bounded by the styles of music that he plays. I mean, he plays jazz and pop music
And
and
funk.
funk. Yeah, I mean, and so all of his examples of learning music have to do with the practicing musician who's trying to play within that style of music. I would argue that his is more a prescriptive list rather than a descriptive list. He's
Mm.
trying to help musicians learn how to play music specifically in that style. He's not describing what's happening in music. And so the elements of music as elements, when you're talking about them as elements, right? We think about, I mean, why are we even using that word elements? That's such a, we're appropriating that from the scientific image of the periodic table of
Yeah, it's
elements,
like the
right?
natural sciences or
Yeah.
geology.
And so it's, for me, the elements of music are the things you need to be able to describe musical sounds in as objective terms as possible. That's why we would use them, and that's the only import they have. um,
And to I
I
think Victor Wooten's point, I think he chose the word groove because he's also
Yeah.
melding in his spiritual uh,
Hmm.
state. It's almost like he's saying music is not so much technically the things that we do or describing how we get there and how these things interact. He's incorporating the spiritual state that one can reach while performing music or the ritual of sound.
Yeah, it's really important to consider. I don't know if he's pantheistic, but well, his theology informs his spirituality, informs a lot of that philosophy as well. I mean, I think early on he produced a music video, his original song of his, "I saw God the other day. He looks like me. She looks like you." And
Correct.
he,
Yeah.
things like that. And so that's important to think about too when we're
But
trying to extrapolate spiritual principles.
and it's also like how John Vervaeke talks about the flow state.
Hmm.
He's so a lot of musicians, as you know, talk about getting into the groove.
Yeah,
And it's this place where it feels like you're transcending time. You're not
yeah,
sure, you're
that's
not
true.
aware of
Yes,
things. You're just in the moment as one
yes,
can be.
yes, yes. I mean, and I'm not trying to critique him like he's wrong. I think that's true. I think that is what musical groove does. I think it does create, like a modern analyst would describe it, as a virtual sense of time, where we're creating time within time, right? Or uh, Charles Taylor and others talk about, well, we have secular time, which is what we sort of go through, but then in religions we have a higher sense of time, like let's call it the Christian calendar. But music instantiates virtual time, and that's why it's also really important for rituals and religious practices and things like that. And groove, absolutely. Just to give you, I don't know, just to give you a biblical example, I think it's 2 Kings 3:15. uh, Elisha the prophet, he's being consulted by the kings of Israel, and they want Elisha to give them a favorable message from the Lord. And then Elisha's very first thing is, before he can give them a word from the Lord, he says, "Bring me a," well, the NIV says, "Bring me a musician." I think it's literally, I think it's like, "Bring me someone who pulls, like someone who plays the lyre or something." Um, and "Bring me a lyre player," and then it says, and then after the musician played, then the word of the Lord came to Elisha.
Well,
And
that's
so
interesting. Like it
what's
doesn't,
happening there?
yeah, like so is it that they're saying bring me a musician? Or does it specifically say bring me one who plays the lyre?
It's bound to the instrument. It's not musician.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and the NIV does this all the time when when it talks about using music and for the musicians, and it's like, and my soapbox is that word music is a loaded word. Like, we have a lot of assumption about what's going on with that word music. Um, Whereas in the ancient Israelite frame, they're not thinking abstractly about music as such. Um, they have these instruments and they have these specialists of the instruments, and any time it talks about musical sound, it doesn't say music. It's talking about sounds that are bounded to those timbres.
Right.
So anyways, that's my soapbox on that.
Yeah, and I think because it's also like we take these words for granted too. Like I know that the Hebrew they don't have a word for history like we use it. They have a word for story.
Well, it's
So
funny because we're always talking about like you got to know what the culture back then says, but I mean the word that's a modern analytical frame that we're applying. That's not in the
right.
Bible. They're not talking about culture. The word culture doesn't even they're not
Well,
talking
it's
about
like the people,
the
like
culture
yeah.
of the Canaanites, the culture of it's such a that's a very modern term.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I know that of course music, like I wonder if David was not referred to as a musician, but one who plays the harp.
Yeah. Yes. True.
So
And
okay. Hmm.
yeah, and just to explicate this point further, it's like we have this concept of secular music and sacred music. We know nothing about whether the ancient Hebrews had like a secular music in the sense of like these folk singers who were just singing secular folk songs. The only music that the Old Testament is referring to is, well, I mean, most of it is in reference to the Levitical musicians, and for temple worship purposes and things like that. So
Yeah, no, I think that was always a tough thing growing up too, is like there's like all the music my friends listening to, and then there's like the Caleb music that I would listen to. Or the contemporary Christian music that would play on the radio. Uh
so
so
anyways, the elements of music.
let's get back to the elements of music. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay,
So the
so
8 elements that I teach.
yeah, go ahead.
So I teach there's two ways you could do this. I teach melody and harmony as separate elements, but some people would combine them into one element of pitch. The only reason I separate melody and harmony is only because I'm teaching Western music, and harmony, there's a lot going on with harmony and there's a lot going on with melody, but they are very interrelated. So you could collapse them into one element of pitch with subcategory A of melody, subcategory B of harmony. Then rhythm, um, texture, timbre, form, expression. Let's see, melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, texture, form, expression. Yeah, that's 7. And then the 8th one I add is context. And so then and I can talk about specific ones. So the terms that are less familiar, texture. Texture is musicologists refer to texture when they talk about the number of voices or instruments used in a performance and the relationship between the parts. So very basic example, you're singing Amazing Grace as a congregation without any instrumentalists. This is a texture called monophonic. No harmony, just the melody line. Okay, as soon as the congregation starts harmonizing into say 4-part harmony or even 2-part harmony, now you have a new texture called homophony. Homophony means that you have a melody that's supported by a harmony. Most Western music is homophonic. It's a melody supported by harmonic and rhythmic structures. If you add a counter melody to the Amazing Grace, let's say there's another choir, or let's say that there's a solo singer, especially you see this a lot in African American churches. They call this person the agitator, where they're singing a response line as a soloist as a counter melody to the main melody. Now you're talking about a different texture that might be called polyphony, where you have multiple melodies intersecting at the same time. So that's texture. Texture is just how do different musical parts relate together. Form is the sections of music. And the most common form that we're all familiar with is the verse, chorus, bridge form in a standard contemporary Christian music song or pop song. Some songs only have one theme. It's just like Amazing Grace is just one theme. It's an A theme. There's just one theme. They call that strophic form. And you just repeat the same little melody line with different texts. Then you have binary form, A, B. You have rondo, A, B, A, C, A, D, A, etc. And so those letters, the A's and the B's, refer to how many different themes there are in the song.
Okay.
Let's see, what would be another one? So expression, expression is in reference to the style that is specific to the genre of music being played. And so the reason this is an element of music is because, okay, yeah, you might have a jazz musician play Amazing Grace. You might have Jimi Hendrix play Amazing Grace. You might have a brass quintet play Amazing Grace, or even a New Orleans brass quintet playing Amazing Grace. And they're all going to stylize it differently. They're going to stylize it using, we would call it articulation or dynamics or changes in tempo. However, those stylistically appropriate ways of playing that same melody is, many people call that the element of expression.
Yeah. Okay. So
yeah.
with expression, it makes me think of like Victor Wooten has a performance of Amazing Grace where he's a solo bass performance, electric bass. And he starts it out, he's playing like the harmonics, very soft, chimey sounds.
I've seen this. Yeah.
And then he gets into more of like a feel good strummy type of pattern. And then he gets into like a slap bass and people start moving and dancing. And there's one particular performance of him doing this on a stage. He's done it for years with lots of different videos out there of this. But there's one I like from like the 90s. And of course, people look like they're dressed from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Awesome. But then it's like the emotional and physical response to each of the different expressions.
Yes.
As he's, he does A, and then he goes back and does A again, but in a totally different expression. As he's doing that, it's almost like there's a whole life with different seasons of life and emotions, and you can see it embodied in the crowd. It's really something to watch because, for example, the first part, people are like sitting in their seats. People have like their wow, like they're just like the huge angel filter on the cameras going, like the sparkles, and then they get into like, say, like the slapping funk bass section, and people stand up, people are like swaying their bodies and clapping, and it's like a full on dance fest. And then he slows it way down, and then they're back in their seats and they're crying.
Yes.
And it's like a very religious moment that's recorded, right? Like a incantation or some type of like priestcraft happening with the musician. It reminds me of a lot of how
that's good.
David, like the conversation that I had with Josh Martin, reading off the unpublished commentary from Mathieu Peugeot on music, where like David uses his harp in a way to change the King Saul, right? So he renewed the king through the performance, the ritual performance of playing the harp. And it's almost like this is happening, and it's like it just feels like Victor Wooten is taking them from one side of the soul to the other, and then back, and then up, and then down, and it is just something to behold.
Yeah, and so the reason I classify expression, and many do, as an element of music is because, again, what you're trying to do with the elements of music, you're trying to describe what is happening in music, and you cannot separate. You can't separate melody in a performance from the style in which it's being performed. And like, because you can't just take the notes, and I mean, you can only go so far in an interesting analysis of like the notes of Amazing Grace. You need to then say, okay, well, when Victor Wooten plays it with this slap bass accompaniment, why is that producing a different effect than that same exact melody being played in a more legato, slower, more more contemplative style, and then this gets into the other element, the eighth element, which is interesting for me because it's not actually about sound as such, but it is so interwoven with the sound, which is context. And context is in reference to the historical, social, biographical, cultural, indeed religious context surrounding the music, and the music in the sense of the person who made it, in the sense of the event in which it's performed, in the sense of the context of the listener who's hearing it or participating in it, all of these things affect the sound and how we interpret the sound. Um, and so that's I teach that as an element of music, because I just don't think you can understand music and why it sounds the way it does without considering those aspects.
Okay, so comparing this list to say like Neil deGrade's, where he has 4 elements, and I think he emerges a lot, or probably combines like 3 categories into one in order to
Yeah.
produce that. But especially like Victor Wooten, who then has spreads it all the way out to 10. But like he has what articulation and dynamics, which you mentioned,
Yeah.
and space. Like there's
I merge those. Yeah.
yeah, so it's interesting how there's like this like compounding
Mm.
thing that you're doing, where it's like, so one element describes 3 of Victor Wooten's,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
one of Neil deGrade's is compounding 3 of yours. So
Yeah.
I just find
Yeah.
it's like there's, as you to your point, there's no universal list. You're the 3rd musician that we've discussed, or music teacher that we've discussed in this podcast. Um, and the list, I mean, there's few overlaps aside from melody, harmony, rhythm. Like even tonality is a classic one. Where would you
Oh, well, yeah,
sort
and this
that?
is, I commented this on one of your videos. Tonality, as Neil deGrade is using it, is what I would call timbre in my list.
Or the
Timbre,
texture?
because he's well, texture is different too. So
Oh yeah, I
so
suppose it is.
timbre is the actual instrument and quality of voice.
Mm-hmm.
So Amazing Grace on a saxophone as opposed to Amazing Grace on a flute, or Amazing Grace with the human voice. This is timbre. You're talking about the actual sound and the instruments and the boxes and the resonators and things like that. And timbre is really, really important. In fact, I think, and so now we get into this question, you brought it up earlier about the order of operations.
Right. Because in your
yeah,
thesis, in the conclusion, I believe it is, you get into this interesting order of operations for melody. And so I wrote down that it was ornamentation, rhythm, form, and text. But then there's also this interesting thing, speaking of tonality, where you distinguish the difference between tonal and modal music.
yeah.
So I know we're kind of getting into the finalities of this, but I'm really fascinated to hear this order of operations and the difference between tonality and modality.
Oh yeah, and so really quick, just to square the circle on tonality. So timbre is how Neil deGrade is using the word tonality. Tonality is typically associated with the element of harmony, in the sense of you're in the key of G major. That's the tonality. It's the tonal center. So tonality, you're talking about major, minor. You're talking about, is it an open fifth or not? So for me, and classically, a music theorist would define tonality as harmony, essentially. So, and so, why are the elements of music useful? I like to think of how do we experience music from a listener's perspective. This is where phenomenology is a really important way that we experience music. It's really important to know. It's like, yeah, well, why do I care about these elements of music? Why do I care about melody and harmony? And I think it's more relevant to discuss what are people experiencing when they first hear music. How do we make sense of music when we're listening to a song, especially a new song that we've never heard before? Let's say you start listening to Indonesian gamelan. How's your brain going to be making sense of that? You're going to be trying to find patterns. And the first thing you hear in a new style of music is not chords. It's not, pitches. It's not even rhythmic groove as such. Really, in my opinion, the very first thing you hear is timbre. Like you hear the instruments or the voices, and that immediately orients your ears to predict certain sounds to happen. And right at the same time is probably texture, in the sense of, if you're hearing one solo banjo player, or if you're hearing an entire bluegrass ensemble, that's you immediately hear that experience of ensemble or solo. And then right after that, you immediately encounter a rhythm. I would say that these 3 things happen simultaneously, and you hear rhythm in the sense of how fast, how slow, is there a groove at all, or is this free tempo, or is there a pulse that I'm trying to get entrained with? Because you could hear music that's totally atonal. There's no tonal center or whatever. It could just be all banging on a piano. But if I'm banging it to a groove, that's an immediate response that you can get as a listener, right? And so after rhythm, then my argument is we then experience form, in the sense of, well, what is form? Form is actually, in my opinion, an extension of rhythm, because form is sections of music over time. So your brain can't process what's happening with chords until you hear a chord progression, until you hear what comes next. We understand that first G chord if there's an E minor chord that follows it. And then our brain's going to predict, if you're used to hearing those two chords happening one after another, your brain's used to predicting, well, maybe it's going to go to a C chord afterwards, right? And so you start filling in the holes, but after hearing a complete cycle of a chord progression, then you can finally start to predict what's going to happen in the music. And then same thing with themes, the melodies in the song. You can't really follow pitches until you hear a complete phrase, and then those two phrases complete a theme, and then that theme repeats, and now we're experiencing melody truly. And so in my opinion, form would be the next big element that we experience as listeners. And then even in the context of a full song, you can't really appreciate the original theme unless you hear it in contrast to the bridge or the chorus, or however many other themes occur in the music. And then once you experience these bigger picture ways of understanding the music, then you can start thinking about individual pitch successions and chords, and what each of those means. I think we spend a lot of time talking about minute details in music when the average listener doesn't experience music that way. You don't have the time to process music that fast. It's like we experience things over time, and that's an important part of how we make sense of music as we're listening to it, and why it's so hard to make sense of music from, like, say, from Southeast Asia. It's because we're trying to find what are the familiar patterns, and they're just not giving you any. You might feel when one happens at the repeat of a cycle, because that's when the big gong plays, and that's the most obvious thing, where the big gong and the gamelan ensemble represents God, and it's a return of the cycle. And you hear the big beat one, okay, something has happened, but the tonality, the melodies, it's a different texture of music called kolatomy, which is like things are interlocking with one another. And it's just this oral experience that you just can't sort it out until you've heard not just that one piece of gamelan music a bunch of times, but you've immersed yourself in the culture and context of gamelan music, where you listen to all sorts of instantiations of it, so that you can begin to become aware of familiar sounds. But even then, you're not going to catch it just by listening to it. You need to be shown. You need an expert to guide you into it. They need to tell you what's important and what's not about the tradition. And then you'll find that there are these elements that happen in gamelan that when an expert teaches you about it, then you'll go back and listen to say, oh yeah, I can hear that now. And then you have a better appreciation for it. So a lot of that appreciation comes from just someone else showing you how it works and why it makes sense.
Yeah, like how a good teacher is one that helps you see, or in music helps you hear what you're hearing. And
yes,
I just think, so it was the order of operation of how we experience new music would be timbre, rhythm, form, and what was the fourth one?
Let's see. I said texture at the beginning as well. I think texture and timbre happen with rhythm pretty simultaneously. And texture, that's still a confusing word, but basically what I'm saying is you hear how many instruments and how many voices are occurring in the music at the moment you start listening to it.
And then number 4 was, let's see.
Yeah. So texture, timbre, rhythm, then form.
Oh, so number 2 was texture. Gotcha.
So I guess, gotcha. and I don't want to litigate, a specific thing. All I'm trying to say is that we hear bigger picture things before we hear those smaller picture things. Expression would be probably up there too. We hear singers bending notes and spinning vibrato, and we hear, stylistically appropriate things that would be endemic of certain genres also pretty quickly.
Right. I remember there's a musicologist, I forget if he was Dave Levitin. This is Your Brain on Music. I forget which one. but
He's
there's,
a neuroscientist.
yeah, neuroscientists into music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, there's an experiment out there where they cut out the very first milliseconds of an instrument striking a note. So like a
Mhm.
violin just starting, like when the bow like actually makes contact with the string and starts, rasping or pulling on it. Um, or like whenever your fingers hits the key on the piano and then the hammer strikes, like that very
Yes.
first
Yeah.
instance, they remove
Yep.
it, and then they brought in a bunch of regular people to and asked them a question: what instrument is it?
Mm.
And the majority of them were wrong.
Yeah,
Be-
you're
be-
right. Yeah, I can totally
because
get that.
without that first color or that first timbre
Yes,
or
tone,
texture.
color, and timbre are both, those are the same terms. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was almost like if you look at the waveform, it's like if you cut that very first part and you just get the tail,
Yeah.
then you're taking out the most critical part of being able to identify um, the instrument as distinct from others.
Yes,
So I
that's
thought
true.
I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of interesting to your point of the order that you've listed. The other thing too is that whenever, like, I was just teaching this with one of my students where she wants to learn a song from ear, as they say, like without sheet music. And so I was like, well, you're just gonna have to listen to it, and you're just gonna have to do like 30 laps, right? You have to listen to this
Mm,
thing 30 times.
yeah.
But you're not going in there. You're not trying to figure out the details right away. You want to start at like the top of the mountain, so to speak, and get like the main themes. Like, so I guess this is kind of like your order of operations in reverse.
Yeah.
Um, well, yeah. So it's like maybe it's not actually. So it's like, okay, what instruments are they playing? Right. Okay. Well, that's a good thing to
Yeah. That's
identify.
super general. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what is it in 4/4? Is it in 3/4? Is it a march cadence, or is it a waltz?
Right.
And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
okay, and then you listen to it another couple of times. Okay, you got that. The next one is like, okay, what sections or what large phrasing themes are happening or form? What are the forms? Right. Oh,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there's just a verse and a chorus, and that's it. Okay, and then they just play those over and over again. Well, you got those. It's like you just get more and more detail, because typically our first reaction is like, what are the riffs? What are the cool things? What are like the garnishes? Um, and it's like, no, we have to actually understand, like, are they using 2x4s? Are they using 2x6s? Like, what's the substructure or the deep structure? Um, Perhaps that's different, but what is like, what are the foundational things? And then you just get
Yeah.
more distinct and more detailed as you go along. And
Well,
kind
it's
of,
so, I played a piece of music in high school for saxophones called the Caprice en forme de valse, which just means it's a caprice in the form of a waltz. And for saxophone, I don't know how many of your audiences are classically trained saxophonists, but there's a piece of music that this piece of music is famous in the repertoire as it's just really fast. There's lots of 16th notes. It's a waltz. It's in, it's in three. I think it's written in 3/8. Um, and there's just a lot happening with all of these passing tones. And if you just look at the piece of paper, you just see black everywhere. And I played that in high school and bombed. It was a really hard piece of music. My
ah,
fingers weren't there. I bombed it.
oh no.
And my adjudicator, she usually after you play, then the adjudicator gives you some coaching for 5 minutes or whatever. And so the thing that she worked on with me was, where's the beat in this? Where is and so she had me pull out all of the 16th note passing tones and identify what are the main notes of this melody. And so the actual melody that's written down is like, there's just so much happening in that. And so she had me pull out all of the decorating tones and try to find what are the main notes and just play bum, bim, bum, bum, bim, bum, bum. And if I can find those tones, then I practice my phrasing to bring out the melody notes, rather than if I'm just playing all the black notes, right? If I could be over prioritizing notes that aren't even essential to, from a listener's perspective, are they even hearing the song that's meant to be heard? So thinking in those bigger picture phrasing, which I think is one of Victor Wooten's elements, think of it in terms of the bigger picture phrases is really helpful for a listener. As a musician trying to learn how to convey meaning through music, I need to be able to convey the things that are most meaningful to a listener.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that was one of his best elements that he described, was like, okay, so all of the other ones, all the 9, phrasing is how you combine all of the other elements into like one, like within time. So like it has a beginning and an end. So if we were to then compare this to language, like some of the best essay advice teaching that I received from a professor, unfortunately at the end of university, gosh, it's like typical. I wish I had learned it like class 1. But he showed me, he's like, no, this is how you write like a sociology type paper or any academic argumentative paper. So you start with your outline, right? You have your thesis, right, which is at the top of the mountain. Like, what's your point? And then, okay, you don't just write, an introduction then. Actually, you write the introduction last. He's like, after that, I'm going to prove it by A, B, and C. And you don't just like start writing A's paragraph. No, don't do that. Write the topic sentence, the first sentence for each of those paragraphs. Right. And then you go back and you fill in with more detail. And then you go back and you write the introduction. And then you write the conclusion. Or sometimes people even say start with when you do the conclusion, all what you're doing is rewording just slightly the thesis and the topic sentences. And then maybe any like, for further thoughts or limitations or reference, kind of slip that in at the end when,
Yeah. For writing a research paper or an argumentative essay that's research based, that formula works great. If you're writing a piece of fiction or a poem, it doesn't work so great.
Right.
There's processes that are more creative processes, I think, that are more salient for the genre of writing that you're referring to.
And it's just like learning classical, because like I had a good friend, she was like, oh, what is that? The very strict classical method for learning piano or any other instrument.
Yeah.
Suzuki method. Anyway, so I put up a Frederick Chopin piano piece in front of her. She could play it note for note.
That's cool.
Because just reading it, like she was like the speed reader, in the music world. And I just could not believe it, because I'm like an all-arounder. So I know how to do that, but it takes me a long time. I'm a slow reader. I have to learn the piece. I can't just like read it and let my fingers like express what the notes are saying on the page. But then I was like, okay, well, do you want to improv off of, like, I don't know, Fallen Leaves or like Autumn in New York, some like jazz tune melody. And it was like she was in another world. She had no idea what to do or say.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So same, essay, great approach. Fiction and poetry, it's sometimes you're in the moment and you just write out step by step, and you don't know what the step's going to be, but you kind of do. It's like this interesting, like low grade teleology or something. It's like, it's a cloudy mirror, but you can still see into it. And you're trying to
improvisation is like, you don't know what's coming until you're in the moment of doing it. And then, you couldn't have predicted what the greatest ideas were going to be. It's just each moment in time leads you to the next. And then great improvisers are responding to what they're hearing at the moment in their environment. But they're also hearing in the future where their ideas are building and where they're going. But then, and then when you get into jazz, where it's like you're responding to other stimuli that's happening, it's like, one of the, a joke from college was like telling the drummer, okay, what I want you to do is during the saxophone solo, I want you to just wham on the snare drum at some random moment. And that should force the soloist to respond, if you're collaborating well, right? Because it's the joint improvisation. So
I like that, the snare slam at random. And you know, like this kind of gets into the wonderful talk that you recently had with Paul Vanderklay on like music, culture, church, world, where like you mentioned Bethel. So my wife's family is and has been connected with Bethel and been members, been uh, serving in their church at different capacities. I find that whole movement interesting because it reminds me a lot of jazz, where there's like
Yeah.
this elevation of the spontaneous or the
Mhm.
improvisation as part of the liturgical acts. So like with how jazz music and I see it following the same type of like progression from say like spontaneous, everything's new to then everything begins being ordered and formalized and becomes tradition. You know, we do it every day in every aspect of life. And what I'm seeing is like how jazz went from free jazz, like we don't even have names for these chords. We don't have like we just like it. Something about it we like, or like we're trying to play off of like some type of irony, or you're trying to make something new from the old. And like it was a wide open
Yeah. Or
frontier.
the chords have names, but they're really boring names and they mean nothing to anyone
Yeah. So
who
well, and
doesn't
then
know
over
the theory.
time,
Yeah.
right. And then over time, the theory came along, and all
Yeah.
of a sudden they had, you know, like you said, there's like, okay, C flat 9 diminished 7, and it's like,
Right. Right. Right.
wow, like the kind of gets longer and longer. And
G7
so
flat 13 sharp 11. Yeah.
yes, yeah, that one, that's actually a good chord. So um so my point is that now we have theory books for jazz. Now we have jazz
Yeah.
standards,
Yeah.
right?
That's
Now we
true.
have traditional jazz music. And I'm sure the musicians that started it out are like, that's the last thing we wanted to create here. Stop it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I see that taking place in Christian music, at least the one, you
Mhm.
know, that or the music that I am aware of and embedded in, where there's spontaneous, right? There's this room for the liturgy where we don't know what's going to happen. You know, God could speak to
Yeah.
us, God could tell us how to
Mhm.
play something at any moment, and we're just going to go with it. And the band plays in this manner. It's very jazz like. And
Mhm.
what I'm seeing now is it's starting to become formalized, where it's
Mm.
pre-scripted, spontaneous moments
Yeah.
where like you hear a recording and it's like, oh wow, how did she come up? That was like the most beautiful poetry. Like she comes up with the
Mhm.
words and the melody in the moment. And like they had not planned to do that. It's not A, B, or C. It's like X, right? The X factor.
Yeah.
Or like the
Yeah.
musicians start playing a song in a way they've never played it before and they just go with it, right? Middle of the liturgy, right? Middle of the service, I should say. And then and then now like okay, so you recognize, wow, that spontaneous thing that she just saying, but then you watch another video and it's like, oh wait, she did the same
Mm.
thing in the same exact way at the similar moment, but are we still calling that spontaneous?
Mm. Yeah,
And
these are good questions. Um, well, I think we figured out the Victor Turner pattern of ritual in the Bethel sense, because Victor Turner, famous ritualist from the late 20th century, wrote a book about ritual. And pretty much anyone who studies ritual today, and anyone who's in the field of the musical study of ritual or the ritual study of music, there's a bunch of sociologists who are studying music from the lens of ritual today. And they borrow from Victor Turner's model, which is basically structure, anti-structure, structure. And I think that that's true of a Grateful Dead concert, where the Grateful Dead, they you know they it became formulaic but predictable, but no less ecstatic, where the first set is pretty straight ahead. It's in rhythm. It's their classic songs. Then they take a break and then they come back. And then it's the improv, what do they call that? Space. And I forget what the other word is, but the space session where there's just a free guitar solo improvisation for that take. And then usually like people have taken psychedelics at this point. and they're at this point they're shamans weaving their psychedelic journey through sound, and then there's the drum section where it's just the drums doing a solo. The other band members go off stage and then they come back on, and that's the anti-structure phase, and then they bring it back to structure where they're ending on a high point, something that's fast rhythm. I read about that in this book, which might be a good book for people to read. This is called Traces of the Spirit, by Robin Sylvan, and this is from the early 2000s, a really, really well-written book. The subtitle of the book is The Religious Dimensions of Popular Music. And so she explains from a sociologist's eye, what are the constructs in popular music? And she gets into like 6 different case studies of different genres and stuff based in San Francisco. One of them being rock music. She's a section on hip hop. And she does a great job of breaking down the sociological, the ritualist, and the ethnomusicological lenses for exploring how does popular music reflect a religious ritual in some sense. So anyways, I think in the case of Bethel, I think if you were talking about, the formulaic spontaneity of the thing, I think it's an embodiment of a very common ritual element of this Victor Turner structure, anti-structure structure, where the first song is always like get the kick drum getting everyone moving, and then there's and then there's the moment of open spontaneity, and then you end on some kind of an anthem that's more rhythmic again, that gets people entrained again. So
yeah, you nailed it. Totally nailed it.
But it works. That's why we do it, right? And so this then gets into the question of, I don't know if it's a dangerous question of, are we using music in a dangerous way, in the sense of creating, like, we're deliberately using musical structures to affect desired trans states in a way that's almost shamanistic, right? We call it the Holy Spirit moving, right? But we know, really, okay, if I just play this G sus chord, and if there's this drone happening under here, and if the drums are playing, this pattern here, and if I can create this euphoric effect here, then I know that we can break through into this new spiritual dimension, right?
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, again, I always use this as my counter example of, like, meanwhile, you go to the Greek Orthodox Church, they're doing chant, right? It's just this very different soundscape, that's not trying to manipulate people necessarily through specific music structures, although maybe they are, right? And it's like, where's this line here between music shamanism on the one hand and letting the Holy Spirit do things in a worship service on the other?
Kind of gets back to like that Victor Wooten scene where he's like taking people on this like journey, all these different ways of expressing Amazing Grace, where there's like this embodied effect or this experience. Like there's a formula, and the top contemporary Christian music artists have figured it out, the worship. Mm-hmm. Oh, and like there was this, I went to play at another church, and they had a pad or this collection of layered textures and instruments that, you press one key on the synthesizer and it's like, right? It's one key masterpiece. And guess what the name of it was called?
What is it?
Altar Call. It was called Altar Call. Yeah, and it was like, something just feels so wrong. It was like this for people I don't know, it's like this climactic moment of a contemporary Christian service where people have the peak of their spiritual and emotional experience. And they respond by coming up front and the music's playing.
I'm not like bashing Christian music or anything like that. Like, I still worship to it, and I still program. When I lead worship, I'm using Bethel songs and others. But I have questions, and I have questions about what we're doing, and I have questions about, do we know what we're doing? When you consider the music of the Bible, when you consider what is Elisha doing when he asks for a lyre player to play so that he can receive a word from the Lord, like, is that not the same thing, right? Where it's a predictive these are musical patterns that we can use predictively to affect the spiritual state that we're ascending to.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And how is that even different? Why would that be any different from building your cathedrals to have those stained glass windows showing those particular patterns? Why would that be any different from the way we use the other arts in concert with one another to produce this Christian aesthetic?
Yeah, my question too is like with the Byzantine chants, Greek Orthodox Church, which, by the way, interesting that there's no instruments allowed. It's all a cappella, it's all vocal.
Yeah.
Uh, which is kind of cool. I'm kind of curious about that. But what interests me is, okay, so where did they get that? Were they borrowing from the cultures around them? Was there some form of appropriation? Like they didn't just come up with these musical chanting styles in a vacuum. Where they borrow, like maybe is before, like we have this, like, oh, that's from the secular world. Oh, that's from Christian world. That's okay. Like, so maybe they didn't even think twice about it. It's like, that's just the music, or that's just the way that the instruments perform.
Yeah. And you can, this opens up a whole thing of like, I just read it in the Bible this morning, Psalm 29 and Psalm 104. Both of them, people believe, were inspired by Canaanite and Egyptian hymns. The content of Psalm 29 has lots of metaphors that are very Canaanite from a specific Canaanite hymn to Baal, and Psalm 104 has lots of similarities to an Egyptian hymn to the god Aten. And I was just reading out in I have the NIV, I have the Cultural Background Study Bible, so I was just reading about that. So it's like, okay, I can see why there would be some overlap in terms of how do the ancient Semites approach sacred chant and music and song. You could see why there would be just some aesthetic similarities or lyric similarities, and then you can apply that same principle, to the whole Bible, like where do these imageries come from, and when we're decorating the tabernacle with those colors and with those patterns and with those shapes, and so with the question of Byzantine Orthodox chant, it's like, well, its immediate ancestor is synagogue chant, and then it develops, it then crystallizes into its specific form, I believe in the 600s or the 700s, and then Byzantine chant is based on 8 modes, which are they're Eastern in the sense of their tunings are microtonal. Like Arabic music, like Indian music, cannot be played in an authentic setting, cannot be played on a Western piano, and it has a very, very refined tuning. And actually, those modes are the basis, or they affect or are influential to subsequent liturgical chant in Islam and in Arabic music, and in those modes that they use in their chants and in their songs. And so the Arabic maqam system is influenced by the Byzantine chants as well. So there's all sorts of cross-pollination musically that happens, and so, to that question of the relationship between the secular and the sacred, and how do musical styles form and coalesce. It's interesting to think about, and I think for me the conclusion is, there is no magic. I shouldn't say magic. There is no universal prescribed form by which we must worship God musically. And there's a field of ethnodoxologists they're ethnomusicologists who study the worship of God in Christianity throughout the world. And they explore concepts of, okay, so this one church in Australia is producing music that everyone in the world is singing. Well, what if this church in Ghana or this church in Central Asia, what if they don't like those songs? Or another question, what if the people who live there who are not Christians, what if they see that the Christians who sing those songs, they must think, oh, well, in order for me to become a Christian, that must mean I must also become a Westerner, right? And they have all sorts of associations of, Western cultural identity and music, right? And so music is and so if we believe that the message of Christ is truly universal and and Christ can be incarnated in any cultural setting, then surely there must be a way to use local worship styles, local musics in a redemptive way that this people can worship God in their heart language in forms that are meaningful to them, in a way that can worship God in a way that's still them,
Mhm.
authentically.
Yeah, I guess that is the mission, I suppose, of like finding that universal song, or maybe we'd be comfortable that the meaning is the same, but we have different expressions.
Well, it's like you look at
I
Revelation,
don't know.
it's
I don't
like
like that.
every people from every tribe, nation, language, and tongue using
Right, right.
1 4 6 5 as their chord progression. No, I don't think so.
Oh man, yeah, the magic pop culture music chord. Yeah, it's like the secret ingredient. 1 4 6 5. So a couple things. The structure, anti-structure, structure reminds me a lot of what David Broder brought up in the trialogue that we had with Gareth Boyd recently, where he was laying out the journey of the warrior, and the warrior has a kind of like an ABA style, where it's you are what was it, preliminary, liminary, and post-liminary, and it's very similar to the way that you just described it. And that also makes me think of modern worship leaders expressing some concern lately of like it becoming scripted, and like finding out the pattern of the way to how'd you say, inculcate, like the or to draw out the max response of emotion and spirit. For example, like, have you read the book The Reset by Jeremy Riddle?
I haven't.
Okay, so Jeremy Riddle is actually my wife's brother, and so he wrote kind of, it's not a tell-all, it's a very it's respectful, but he wrote this book last year right before Christmas time, and in it he's like, pretty much like, we've got the formula down in the West. We've got it down and we know how to use it, which is kind of dangerous and scary, to your point. And it has him like kind of backpedaling a little bit of like, what have we done? Have we created something that is too powerful in and of itself? Even though maybe it was done in like the right heart, like a heart of worship, you could say. But now it's getting weirder because the new people coming in, they don't remember what came before, or what we did before this was new. So this is the I don't know, the fishbowl that they swim in now. And it's getting weird because now it's professionalized. Now you can make a living off of it, and there's lots of people pouring in. So now there's more competition. So he was basically trying to describe the mess that is, or the challenge that faces worship leaders today.
Well, it's interesting that we're wary of things being scripted, because on another level, it's like all religions are scripted. You do the ritual patterns that are, well, you have prescribed rituals, and they on another level they should be the same or continuous. And I think an illustrative case example might be, let's look at Black American church music. That's scripted. There's a musical liturgy that they're used to doing it. They have their chord progressions, they have their style. Now it's not, I mean, it's very different than the contemporary Christian music style. It's very much, there's lots of jazz happening there. There's lots of, rhythm and blues types of chord progressions happening there, altered dominance, secondary dominance, and really interesting chord progressions from a jazz perspective. There's all sorts of things that are, let's say repetitive, or you would expect to find them each time you went and attended a service, to the point that you don't even have to be a Christian musician to sit in on these bands. Like they'll hire secular jazz musicians to sit in on the praise band because they know the songs,
Yeah,
they know
yeah.
the hits, they know the riffs, they know the chords, they know the feel, right? And sometimes it's preferred to have someone that can play it right, you know, even if maybe they haven't been going to church on their own, you know. So um, yeah, that's another example.
Yeah. What would you say? Like
So my
musician
yeah
priest for hire? I don't-
yeah right exactly yeah you know yeah and so it raises like I guess my question here is like you know it's just interesting that we have an expectation that it's new and fresh each time or that we would expect there to be newness in you know in the repertoire. Think about how much church music has changed over the last 100 years, like since
Mhm.
as opposed to I don't know from the Reformation until the 1900s. You know the style of music in churches was hymns for a
Oh,
good long while.
and do you know where the hymn started out with Martin Luther? From the pub.
uh, yeah
That's what I heard, at least. Is like he
no
basically
that makes
like he
yeah
went to the pub and was like, okay, how do we like take the melodies from the folk music and then make it the
yeah
music of the people, and then
mm-hmm.
you know put the psalms in it or something, or the gospel message. So I think that there's the question is like, well, two things. So from our backgrounds, you know, like say like Assemblies of God, Chi Alpha, Pentecostal, charismatic,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know,
Yeah
it's probably the best keywords I could come up with. um
yeah
it's like there's always that reformation, and I feel like as I've gotten older that
yeah
cycle is just faster. Like we're reforming while we're still in the process of the last reformation.
that's so true
And
yeah
so like we're trying to deconstruct before we even finish the thing that we were constructing before. And so it's kind of dangerous. So I think there's this character trait that we have to identify in
mm.
all of this. But then the second thing is that whenever we look at the source or the script, like where's it coming from? And like you look at Bethel music and all I hear is U2. You know, it's like, and you know, like
The aesthetic yeah
not to bash U2, it's great. Or it's like maybe Coldplay or like um Explosions in the Sky, right? Really bringing in that like four guitar layers, um and texture and keypads and the so like you look at the influences and then you bring that in to the church and try to integrate that into the identity. And it's like my question is like, okay, so that was pop music written to make money, primarily to get popular, so you make a lot of money. Perhaps we should be a little bit more cautious in how we filter what comes in before we just, you know, make it the climax of our service. um I think that's, at least from what I can tell, is, and based on like Jeremy Riddle's book and other ones like it, like there's this feeling of like maybe we should pump the brakes a little bit and start discussing the meaning or the deep structure
mm.
of what it is that we do and
yeah
why we do it.
yes that's good that's a really good uh that might even be a really good note to end that on just I tweeted you know Paul Anleitner.
No.
Um, so
Oh,
he's a yeah, Paul, he does the Deep Talks
yes,
podcast.
deep talks. I know,
Yeah,
I'm familiar with Paul.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. He's also a musician, talks a lot about worship.
And he was
Um,
on Paul Vanderklay's channel as well.
yeah,
I heard his first talk with Paul. That's right.
yeah. Um,
Yeah, interesting story. Go ahead.
so anyways, I was tweeting at him on Twitter and but I made this observation about you have and this goes back to my conversation with Paul towards the end of it's like we still have this Woodstock in the church, you know,
Oh, yes, right.
and you could have like a Bible preacher who's like using well okay so like Protestant Bible teaching is like if you're teaching the Bible in a service it's very Well, it goes back. It's like that essay writing structure. Like this is a modernist way of conveying information. The lecture, right? And lots of them are very. It's like you're attending a professor's lecture on theology. Exegeting the text, but meanwhile, your band is super postmodern. Like you might have the band in skinny jeans, and you have the synth pad
Mm-hmm.
and modern sounds. You have your altar call button,
Yeah. Yeah.
fog machine lights. So it's like there's this weird like bipolar liturgy of like a modernist approach to teaching the Bible, but then this postmodern musical application and participation of the community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I see coherence in other liturgical traditions. I see coherence in the African American church, where the preaching and the music are participatory, right? It's not
Right.
presentation. It's not presentational preaching over here in a very cerebral context, taking notes, learning about the culture, writing down interesting, intellectual things, and then this like anti-intellectual musical approach over here, where it's like you bypass the brain and go straight to the heart. I've heard some people say, it's like it's
Mm.
not about thinking over here. That to me, it's a very bipolar or dichotomous liturgy, whereas in an African American church liturgy, in the Catholic Mass, in Orthodox services, there's more of a coherence in the epistemology of the teaching of the Word of God, and the other participational elements in the liturgy. Just an
Mm.
observation I have about churches, Protestant churches, especially evangelical churches.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great, how do you say it, like discussion across the different denominations or traditions of Christianity, where some could help inform the other. Because I know, like with Catholicism, the friend Andrew Tran has been a guest earlier on this program, where so he grew up Catholic, and he's describing that Catholicism had this like modernization phase, later in the 20th century, and it didn't go so well for them. And so like now they're kind of at this point of like regrouping and saying, maybe we should just be Catholic and that's who we are. And when you come to a Catholic youth group, like it's going to be Catholic. It's, it's not going to be like an event center or something. But I think this discussion is I think this is about as far as we could take it at the moment,
Yeah.
because it's in process, because a lot of the discussions need to take place beyond this and throughout the churches, because something needs to give to where it's like, how far does it go? Like,
Yeah.
how many lights and how much stage production is too far? Like, do we just hire Bono? He could be our worship leader, like,
Or
who knows,
Justin
maybe,
Bieber.
or Justin Bieber. Oh boy. Yeah. So it's like, to come out with, him singing, I don't know, what you would call it, a standard, a traditional modern Christian worship song one day,
Mm-hmm.
with a global church. And then the next single he comes out with is the most like sexual, degrading, just debauchery. It's like, yeah, great. Like, what? Thanks for coming to our church and singing Amazing Grace. Appreciate it. Meanwhile, you're just like totally degrading women the very next thing you come out with. So Drew, any final thoughts, or what do you think, man? Is this a good conclusion?
Well, there was a lot there. The sun was out when we started talking. Yeah, I mean, we didn't get to the thesis at all, which is totally fine. Maybe a subject of a future conversation. But I really liked the direction that we took. It was as I expected it would be, a very jazzy conversation, and we played it by ear. And I mean,
Jazzy, yeah.
the movie Arrival was not an expected talking point, but that became a really good launching point for all sorts of interesting topics. So
Drew, this exceeded my conversations, because we got to talk about aliens and music and language and Arrival. What could be better?
It's got just about everything in there. Yeah.
So yeah, maybe
Well, thank
next.
you. I really appreciate your time.
Oh,
I love these
I'm
conversations.
just
Man.
so
So
grateful that, you reached out, that you're active, just hit up the comment section, and it led to this, which is, gosh, just a fruitful, amazing conversation.
it was great. Yeah, I loved it.
So how about maybe we'll bookmark for next time. Uh, if you're up for it, we could talk a little bit more in detail about your 250 pages of, master's level research, and
Okay.
um, because I would like to know more about distinguishing music that's maybe has what would you call it, the deep structure of tonality or modality.
Yeah, that's a
And
really
then we
good
could
bookmark.
then
Yeah.
you could actually bring up your examples that
Hmm.
you studied, obviously in great detail. So
Yeah.
sound good?
That sounds great. Thank you, Derek.
All right, man. Well, appreciate your time. Till next time.
Until next time.